Well, welcome back, everybody. I am here with Mr. Chris Dalby, an investigative journalist and the director of World of Crime. It's very good to speak to you today, Chris.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, Ben. Thank you for the invitation.
So, for those of our audience who might not be familiar with your work, could you give a kind of a brief introduction as to what you do and your general focus of your organization?
Of course. So we do two things. One, we do investigative journalism around the world on drug trafficking, particularly looking to understand what are the latest shifts in organized crime and help police and lawmakers react quickly to what are the latest techniques among drug trafficking gangs. Why do we do that? Because we found that law enforcement is usually a couple of steps behind organized crime. It's no fault of their own. Organized crime is the most adaptable business in the world. So we try and sort of reduce that gap.
So, when it comes to the drug trafficking issue in Europe more broadly, we know that obviously Europe has its own homegrown drug gang problem. In particular, here in Ireland, we have many infamous cartels that have made international headlines. But I believe there's also a connection to South American and Central American gangs that are using Europe as a market and as a hub for some of their activities. I'm wondering if you could talk about how Ireland is related to some of these South American gangs and their activities.
Because of Ireland's position geographically, it's an obvious stopping off point for drugs coming in from South and Central America, going into both for the Irish market, for the UK, and for the rest of the EU. However, Europe right now is in a pincer movement. There is the classic incoming of cocaine from the West, but there's obviously heroin also from Afghanistan and Myanmar, but more and more synthetic drugs coming in from Russia and other parts of Central Asia. So Ireland is actually a little bit atypical for Europe in that obviously its problem right now is very still centrally Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, those South American drug gangs. But I think that's going to change as the years go forward. Irish gangs, obviously, as Ireland's economy has grown in the last 25, 30 years, there's been a home-driven market for cocaine. And obviously the Kinahans, the Hutches, others have made billions of dollars off that market. But the issue now is that Irish gangs are crucial players on an international level. If they're not just looking to cater to, buying cocaine in Central and South America and bringing it to Ireland for the Irish market. Irish gangs like the Kinahans are pivots in a multipolar drug trafficking world, where, for example, right in 2020 to 2022, we know that traffickers from Ireland, from Italy, from Turkey, from Bosnia, from Spain were allying together to buy cocaine in bulk to drop the price, bringing it into Europe together and then splitting it up into what they needed on an individual basis. So the Irish gangs can't be seen or can't be resumed to just being an Irish problem.
So when it comes to Europe and Ireland specifically being used as you put it, a pivot point, I suppose what relevance does that have for law enforcement, not just here in Europe, but in America as well, in terms of Ireland being kind of the door to Europe for some of this stuff that I suppose what I'm asking is how important is the job of Irish authorities in cracking down on this to prevent these activities spreading throughout the European continent?
It's absolutely pivotal. I would divide the US market. The US market is an end market for drugs, and Europe is an end market for drugs. And I think they work quite differently, right? The demand for drugs in America is very different to what we see in Europe. I'm sure we'll touch upon fentanyl at some point today. Ireland is going to be one of the first countries that sees a shift in the way that Latin American drug cartels and their European partners do business, right? So what do we see? We see the barrier to entry for European gangs buying cocaine lowering. So it used to be that you'd have to be, a Kinahan level organization or an Italian mafia level organization to be able to forge those connections over time, to import tons and tons and tons of cocaine over time. However, with the price of cocaine higher than ever in Europe, the accessibility of cocaine higher than ever in South America, you do see more and more smaller European groups going to the source and making their own deals. That makes the job of Irish law enforcement and obviously European law enforcement far more difficult, because you're not just looking for the Daniel or the Christopher Kinahans or the Jerry Hutches. You're looking for far smaller crooks who suddenly have their own business connections in South America. So I couldn't tell you how many drug gangs today independently are making cocaine deals, but I suspect it's a lot higher than we think.
And on that, we have this issue in Ireland that's been going on for many years now, where there is a recruitment and retention crisis both in the military and also the police, that the numbers of actual officers who are signing up to become Gardaí is extremely low, and there's an attrition there, and this has been a long-running problem for the government. It's gotten to the point where our Navy is down to 1 or 2 ships, that there's not enough naval crew to actually man them, and obviously that makes it difficult to patrol our territorial waters, and that's how many of these drugs enter the state, is through shipping and so on. So I suppose, do you think that is a major issue when it comes to dealing with the importation of drugs and cutting off the supply lines of these criminal organizations?
Yes and no. Cocaine seizures are very good. They're very positive. They play very well. And obviously, any amount of drugs that is interdicted is good because it's not on the streets. So obviously, a weakened Irish Navy, a weakened Irish presence at airports, at ports, less detection capabilities, obviously means more drugs are going to go in. And trust me when I say drug traffickers will pick up on that. And when they see a chink in the armor in Europe, they will exploit that until that chink is addressed. So yes, a lowering of means and equipment out there will mean more drugs entering Ireland for sure. However, a lot of European governments and law enforcement stop at the number of seizures. If the number of seizures are up, they're happy. If the number of seizures are down, they're happy, because in both of those cases, you can spin that, right? You seize more drugs, we're doing a better job. You seize less drugs, European traffickers are going somewhere else. Ireland is strong. However, the way in which drugs are moved, the paths through which drugs are moved are infinite, right? You can go through smaller ports. You can send them through the mail. You can go through third-person countries. Now you can, obviously you can put them on container ships. You can put them on drug submarines, which are reaching Europe in increasing numbers. Increasing now, one of the big things that I'm talking about with law enforcement is what we call chemically concealed cocaine. Chemically concealed cocaine is when cocaine in a liquid form is dissolved into clothing or cardboard or textiles. And that's undetectable by scanners and by most sniffer dogs unless they're specifically trained. So that, for example, in London or Antwerp is what's getting through most of the time. So it's not just bolstering the number of people and the number of ships that's going to protect Ireland from the drug trade.
Do you think that submarines carrying drugs are making their way to Ireland? I know you said that it's happening in Europe more broadly, but would you be surprised if that was happening here as well?
I don't have any evidence to say that they have, because they've never been caught. I would not be surprised if they are. We know that only a handful, 2 or 3, have been seized in Spain, and Spain is the closest obviously geographic point. In Spain and Portugal are the closest geographic point to South America. We know that they go to Africa and then hug the West African coast up to the Iberian Peninsula. I won't say whether I think they have reached Ireland or not. It wouldn't surprise me if a drug submarine was found. Several have been caught in late 2024 going to Australia from South America, and that's a hell of a lot further.
So if you were advising the Irish government and Irish law enforcement in terms of how to tackle this issue, what would be your number one piece of advice that you would say needs to be addressed head on?
International collaboration is key, and data sharing and following the money is more important than drug seizures. Drug seizures are crucial. You should absolutely keep doing that. But following the money, data sharing with South American and Central American ports, participation in Europe-wide interdiction efforts is what's really going to make a difference long term. You are never going to stop the flow of drugs just by seizing drugs. You're never going to stop the number of drug traffickers just by putting people behind bars. That's crucial, and you should keep doing that. But what's going to make a difference is the long-term cutting off of different supply routes, right? So if you can work with international banking systems and financial systems to follow the money, understand the way in which money is being moved through Ireland or by Irish drug gangs, cut those flows off, that's where you're going to see meaningful progress over time. Also, what I would advise Irish law enforcement, Irish policymakers, is don't focus on the short term. Yes, a seizure of a ton of drugs is nice. It looks good in a report. But that's not the end goal. The end goal is rolling up the entire operation that can get 10, 15, 20 tons of drugs into Ireland a year. Don't stop at the water's edge. Don't focus on individual arrests. Don't focus on individual seizures, but work with international partners as much as possible to follow the money over multiple years, to follow people over multiple years. Understand how the evolving role that Ireland is playing in the entire European drug trafficking platform.
How important would you say Ireland is to? Would you say Ireland is one of the most important countries when it comes to the European drug trade? Would we be rank up there in, say, the top three?
Top three, top other, indubitably up there. Yes, for several reasons. One, it's a very convenient entry point. It gives access to Europe very easily. It gives access to the UK very easily, and there are also very sophisticated drug trafficking partners that your South American gangs, your Mexican gangs could partner with in Ireland. So yes, in terms of criminal infrastructure, geographic position, and size of market, Ireland is an obvious target.
Moving to fentanyl, because we were talking about synthetic drugs earlier on. With fentanyl entering Ireland now, that's a kind of a relatively new phenomenon for this country. A couple of years ago, there was a report by the police that Irish drug gangs, as you said, had gone to South America to cut deals with cartels about importing fentanyl into the country, which is, of course, a very dangerous, deadly drug that is worse in many ways than some of the more traditional drugs, if you want to put it that way, that these gangs deal in. And that's something that we did begin to see, where a load of prisoners ended up overdosing within the Irish prison system because some drugs, fentanyl, had been imported into the prison system. So we've seen little bits here and there, pieces of evidence to indicate that this stuff might be trickling in. Nitazines, another one, caused a whole load of overdose deaths. How do you think that might influence the Irish drug landscape if those drugs start to take hold within the Irish drug market?
It's important to not give in to fear. I looked at that prison overdose, I believe it was in late 2023. Perhaps I missed something, but I didn't see any evidence that that fentanyl was brought into Ireland from abroad. Medical fentanyl is used in every country in the world, including in Ireland, by cancer patients for severe cases where painkillers are needed. It is a very potent painkiller, and that is how it was first developed. As far as I know, in the European Union and in the UK, apart from the one country, which is one of the Baltic countries, there's been no case that I know of fentanyl from abroad coming in and killing people. What we see in Europe is medical fentanyl being deviated or stolen and used in the same country. I believe that's what happened in the case of those prisoners. Obviously, I can't say that with certainty. Certainly, if we see Mexican-made fentanyl entering the European Union, that would mark a whole new chapter and a major cause for concern in Europe. However, there's a couple of reasons that's not happening. One, there's little reason for Mexican drug cartels to be focused on the European market. They're right next to the US, right? It's much more convenient, much more cheaper, much easier for them to get fentanyl into the US. Even though the US is aware of fentanyl and drug overdoses are going down now, last year for the first time on fentanyl, it's still a very convenient market. So at the moment, I have not seen evidence firmly that Mexican cartels are looking to exploit fentanyl in Europe. Does that mean they didn't have a meeting with Irish gangs? Of course, that's a possibility. Nitazines are a whole other preoccupation, because nitazines are a synthetic opioid that is killing people in Europe. In the over 100 people in recent years in the UK. Nitazines are not as potent as fentanyl, but they're also much more difficult to police because they're much more varied. They share a lot of commonalities with fentanyl in the way that it's produced. It's very easy to obtain that from China. There's been reports of Chinese, Indian chemical companies that make compounds that can be used to produce nitazines and sell those online very cheaply to anyone. That can also almost be bought on an individual level, right? That's very worrying, because obviously that level of individual purchases or small purchases cannot be controlled. unless you ban all chemical trade from China, which isn't going to happen. So understanding nitazines, I would say, is more urgent than fentanyl.
So moving then to the US, obviously in the last couple of weeks we've seen Donald Trump and the opening salvo of his presidency when it comes to border control and cracking down on the gangs. He's declared the cartels terrorist organizations through executive order, and this is something that he made a big deal about during his campaign. To what extent do you think that will actually do them serious harm? Are they worried about that, or is this something that they are agile enough to circumvent?
It's something they're agile enough to circumvent. Trump's concern about fentanyl and the way in which migrants are used to smuggle drugs into the US is valid. However, his description of it is simplistic to the point of absurdity. Absolutely, Mexican cartels and other gangs from Latin America are a major security threat to the US and are the cause of tens of thousands of deaths in the country, if not hundreds of thousands. However, the Mexico-US border is the most busy border in the world, both for tourists or for individual and commercial goods. You're not slowing that down, right? Unless there's a 9/11 level terrorist attack, and then only for a little bit would you see a block of the Mexico-US border. Yes, sometimes drugs are brought across by migrants. So if you reduce the number of migrants, that avenue might be temporarily reduced for the cartels. But there are so many ways to get drugs across the border. Also, largely in the trunks of cars, of which millions, tens of millions cross the border every year. US citizens go into Mexico in and out. Many of them have connections to Mexican cartels. Also, part of the production of fentanyl has actually been delocated outside of Mexico. So we now see final production of fentanyl in Canada, for example. The product can be imported, or the precursors can be imported into Canada, if not Mexico, and then the pills can actually be pressed in Canada. And while Trump has antagonized Canada as well, there's much less attention at that border. There are always ways around any police or law enforcement on a border that wide and that busy.
So that obviously sounds, judging by what you've said, like the moves that he's taken to date will not substantially decrease the problems he's aiming to solve. What should he do? Again, I suppose sort of like I asked about the Irish authorities. If you were advising President Trump, what would you recommend to try and tackle this issue?
I mean, you absolutely have to keep putting pressure on the cartels. I'm not saying that there's nothing you can do. What I'm saying is that intelligent policing, targeted scanning, following of certain individuals, working with Mexico to create economic alternatives for the communities that are forced to make fentanyl or grow cocaine, if you're talking about Colombia and Venezuela. Give them an option. Give them something else to do. Give them other ways to make money that is not fentanyl or cocaine, right? That obviously is not going to be in President Trump's playbook anytime soon. Secondly, investing inside the US on community awareness. That has actually wielded some success under President Biden. We saw the deployment of Narcan, which is this drug that you administer to people having a fentanyl overdose. We've seen overdoses fall sharply, partly in result of the awareness of that spread and the availability of Narcan. Working inside the US on why these communities are taking drugs, on offering counseling, on offering treatment. But again, that's not part of the Republican Party platform at this time. I think that the demonization of cartels, while not taking in any way away from the fact that they are barbaric organizations that do need to be combated, calling them terrorists and saying that you're going to put tariffs on Mexico as long as fentanyl keeps crossing the border is ridiculous. Because the Mexican government, while, yes, very corrupt and often in cahoots with elements of the cartels, would struggle to, within one day, say, we're now going to stop all fentanyl production in Mexico. The problem with fentanyl is that it can be made anywhere. You can make it in your shed, right? Synthetic opioids and synthetic drugs like fentanyl do not require weather, do not require agriculture, do not require knowing where the plantations are. They can be made by anybody like a meth lab.
It sounds like kind of a desperate situation in the sense that the Mexican authorities are so woefully and notoriously corrupt that you would have very little confidence, or at least I would, as somebody who's not an expert in this stuff, have very little confidence in their ability to get to grips with it, given that so many of them are on the payroll in one form or another. And I mean, even recent comments by the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, have not been particularly encouraging as to her willingness to admit the scale of the problem. Do you think there's any hope for Mexico and countries like Mexico solving these problems in-house, even with external US pressure? Because I might get your thoughts as well on a related note on what Nayib Bukele has done in El Salvador with MS-13 and whether something like that is replicable in another country. Obviously, Mexico is a much bigger country than El Salvador. I don't know that the same solution would scale to a nation of that size. Do you have any thoughts on whether there's hope for these countries to fix their own problems?
Look, I've lived 7 years of my life in Mexico. It's a country I adore and have a deep admiration for. There's always hope. Mexico on its own will not solve its problems, right? I would say that Salvador didn't solve its problems. We'll get to that in a second. Mexico and the US working together is what's needed to at least reduce the scale of the cartel problem. But that requires decades of coordinated, long-term, sustained investment in these communities to help people find economic alternatives. We see it in Colombia. Colombia, while far from a success story, has had success in the short term at incentivizing those who produce coca or make cocaine to do something else because they provided economic alternatives. When you don't, when you live in these poor communities, crime is all around you, and you make fentanyl or you traffic drugs or you sell drugs because that's the only way to buy your mother a house. As one trafficker famously told me, when I asked him, why do you do this? He goes, I want to buy my mother a house, which, while I don't condone what he did, is an understandable drive for a young man in a poor environment, right? I'm again, when I make these comments, I'm often accused of being soft or humanizing the drug traffickers. Not at all. They should be punished for what they've done. But unless we understand what makes young people do it and begin to wall off the reasons they do so, you're not going to make any difference in the long term, apart from killing or jailing people.
On that note, then, this is an incredibly oversimplified, simplistic assessment of the situation. But if I was to ask this stupid question, the ignorant question, why couldn't Mexico do what El Salvador did, just build a massive prison that can contain 500,000 people and just chuck a load of gang members in there, round up anybody we see with face tattoos and be done with it? Why wouldn't that work? I'm sure it wouldn't. I'm sure that's too simple, but I'd love to hear your thought on it.
The first answer might make some people chuckle, but Mexico is a stronger democracy than El Salvador. While Mexico is sclerotically corrupt, it still has some institutions and some courts and some human rights standards that would probably get in the way of that. I realize that sounds ridiculous in a country with upwards of 30,000 homicides a year. Mexico is also far bigger and far more numerous than El Salvador. El Salvador is a small country. The formation of the gangs in El Salvador was far better understood. I mean, you're talking about gangs that largely grew in the US and then entered El Salvador with people who were deported from the US. That is, that is the origin of the MS-13 and Barrio 18. And of course, gangs with very prominent visual identifiers, right, with the tattoo culture. Also, you have to understand that while the policy in El Salvador has been a success, absolutely, in terms of reducing violent crime, reducing street crime, making people feel safer, absolutely, that you can't deny that, right? But what's the long-term play here? You've got an actual percentage of the adult population in prison. People tried in their dozens or hundreds with no due process. People thrown in jail for the barest association to gangs, right? Former gang members, their partners, anyone who was suspected of work with them. We have testimonials. I have testimonials of people in El Salvador telling me if I didn't pay bribes to the police, they said they would put me in jail as a gang member and nobody would know that I wasn't, right? So what does that do to a country long term? Of course, right now, violence is down, drug trafficking is down, rape is down, extortion is down massively, for sure. I'm curious what happens in 5, 10, 20 years, right? What are the ramifications to a country, right? Because Bukele has essentially built a dictatorship on the success of that policy. So I just use that as a caution tale. Mexico is a country of tens of millions of people, with the cartels far more spread out, far better armed, and far more numerous. We saw what happened in 2006 when President Calderon at the time launches the army to bring in the cartels, and that's what sends Mexico's violence soaring to heights that it's never recovered from. Physically they could build a prison and put 200 or 500,000 people in jail. I don't think that would solve your problem. You're not solving the socioeconomic conditions that led to the cartels in the first place.
So I believe you have a new book coming out on the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua gang. Would I be right in saying that?
Exactly. So World of Crime is also a publishing house. We regularly publish books trying to demystify and explain why the most powerful gangs in the world became how they are. We published a book last year on Mexico's Jalisco cartel, New Generation, who is by far the most violent organization in Mexico. And in March and then in May, we're publishing 2 books on Tren de Aragua, which might not be a household name to viewers in Ireland, but is the #1 gang being discussed right now in the US. It's a Venezuelan gang that grew from just a prison gang, and in 8 years has become one of the most powerful gangs in Latin America. So if your viewers are interested in understanding how these gangs function in a way that I think has not been told before, they might find it interesting.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time, Chris.
No, my absolute pleasure, Ben.